I want to make it very clear at the beginning of this video that yes, I am very aware that there was a pretty high profile incident related to gentlemen's agreements in Yu-Gi-Oh! Back in 2015, and while I will spend some time of this video talking about that because it is the last instance of gentlemen's agreements and probably will always be the last instance of them, there is so much more to this discussion than just that one particular Nekroz tournament. In today's video, I want to talk about what a gentleman's agreement in relation to Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, and also talk about if it's legal or not, and then also talk about 3 distinct instances where gentleman's agreements were used at a competitive tournament level. So what is a gentleman's agreement when we're talking about Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, it usually shows up in 2 forms. It's basically an agreement with the players among other players to not play a card or deck. I say card or deck even though the examples that I'm going to use in today's video all relate to cards, but in some cases a gentleman's agreement is basically the players going outside of the rules and making their own separate ruling, usually restricting cards or decks that they can play. If we're talking about a deck being restricted, we're talking about a group at like a local tournament saying, hey, let's not play meta at this tournament. Now, if this is an official tournament, you can't actually restrict people from playing the meta because that's not allowed. However, if every single person participating at that locals does a gentleman's agreement to not play meta, well then probably most of them won't do it unless you have one scummy person that's just trying to get a free win at that locals, although at a local level that probably isn't going to happen just because if you're all in agreement of doing that, you're just doing it for the fun of it. What's important here though is that just because the majority of people say that they're going to not play meta doesn't mean that you're required to not do that. Yes, it might be a little bit scummy to go against their wishes, but you're allowed to play whatever you want. That's just how it goes. But the more common gentleman's agreement that was used in Yu-Gi-Oh's history had to do with individual cards, and usually they had to do not before the tournament started, but in between games. What I mean by this is that in the past, as we'll talk about in today's video, there are certain cards that the players felt should be banned, and they made a gentleman's agreement to not play them in games 2 or 3. Now this is done on a game-to-game and match-to-match basis, and once again, you have to realize you're not required to accept a gentleman's agreement, and you're also not required to follow it if we're looking at strict policy. This is because it's a gentleman's agreement. It's not an official ruling. How this usually went, and we'll talk about this in today's video, is that one player would say, would you like to side this card out, usually referring to a limited overpowered card, and then they would reveal it from their deck, face up in their side deck, and then their opponent would do the same. In this way, you both knew that you didn't have the card in your main deck, and that's how gentleman's agreements pretty much went for the longest time. However, it is worth mentioning that if we look at the newest policy, although this has been in place for a while now, gentleman's agreements technically, when you reveal the card that you're putting in your side deck, are not legal. That is not allowed. The reason being is that your side deck and main deck are treated as private knowledge, especially in between games, which means you are technically not allowed to reveal a card that you are taking out of your main deck and putting it in your side deck. This gets a little bit trickier because this means that to do a gentleman's agreement, or if you were going back in the day and doing those, you would have to say, okay, I'm going to side out this card, will you do the same? The problem is that if you follow the policy and the other player keeps the card in their main deck, sure, they might scum a win, and that's sort of a morality question, but in terms of sheer game knowledge, a gentleman's agreement is not up to the official rules, which means they can't be punished for it. Maybe you sided out your overpowered card, but they kept theirs in. Konami can't punish them for that because it's not in the rules that gentlemen's agreements are allowed in the first place. That being said, let's talk about the first time I, as a player, experienced a gentleman's agreement, which was in the latter half of 2013. What's funny about this is that there was actually 2 cards, and it was in the Dragon Ruler Mirror match where there would be a gentleman's agreement to side out both Return from a Different Dimension and Sixth Sense. Both these cards were Saki 1-ofs that if either player drew them and the other one didn't, you almost always won those games, so the players would agree to side them out, and they would side them out face up. Admittedly, this should be said here that gentlemen's agreements in general are favoring the better player. Cards like Return from a Different Dimension and Sixth Sense are very sacky cards and oftentimes could cause an upset if the worst player drew them when the better player didn't. In this way, the better player would heavily be encouraged to do the gentleman's agreement as often as possible, because by reducing variance, they could use their own player skill in the mirror match to beat their opponent. In this way as well, though, if you were the worst player and you knew that and you could admit that sort of thing, you wanted to keep those high variance cards in your deck to give you the best chance of sacking your opponent. I realize it's hard to admit that you're the worst player in a particular match, but by doing this, you gave yourself the best chances of winning, because if you knew just on paper in your head that you couldn't beat your opponent in a fair fight, well yeah, just keep in those unfair one-ofs and hope you draw them to get an instant win. That being said though, I think a lot of players, myself included back in the day, didn't realize that that's why gentlemen's agreements generally existed, and we all just sided those cards out because we thought the other player, the better player, wanted it to be a fair fight. In reality though, they wanted it to be a fair fight so they could use their superior intellect and skill to just beat me in a game. That's totally fine, but it is a sort of unique application of the gentleman's agreement. In a lot of cases, people really did think it was to make the game more fair and take out these broken cards, when in reality, people just wanted to beat you in any way possible, and that meant reducing variance over each game. And then I noticed the second sort of gentleman's agreements about a year later, and that was when Vanity's Emptiness was limited. Once again, you have a sacky one-of trap card that was often played in the big combo decks to totally lock their opponents out of the game. In these cases, a lot of people are playing those combo decks were stuck with a really awkward position. Do you keep cards in like MST and other back removal just in case your opponent has that one copy of Vanity's Emptiness, or do you just take them out and hope your opponent doesn't draw it? Well, many of the good players figured out if you just did a gentleman's agreement to side out Vanity's Emptiness, if your opponent was going first, they no longer could draw that card because it was sided out, and now you didn't have to play any forms of back removal, nor did you have to risk getting shut out by a one-of trap card that your opponent drew and you don't have an out for. However, unlike the case of Return of the Different Dimension and Sixth Sense, it's worth mentioning that Vanity's Emptiness didn't always work for a gentleman's agreement, because in some cases, if you were playing a slower based trap strategy, you wouldn't really care about your opponent having Vanity's Emptiness. For example, if you were playing Satellar Knights, you have a ton of trap cards and a ton of ways to deal with a face-up emptiness without really changing your deck that much, which meant that you didn't really mind if your opponent had it in their deck, you just want to make sure you have it in yours. In those ways, you weren't always doing the gentleman's agreement for Vanity's Emptiness. Not that anyone is ever required to do that back when they were being done. However, it's worth mentioning that, yeah, it only really worked when both players were either playing the same deck or the same type of deck. In the case of Emptiness, you're looking at both players using a combo deck is the most common situation where they're both siding out the Emptiness as a gentleman's agreement. And that brings us to the final time that a gentleman's agreement was ever done in Yu-Gi-Oh! And probably we will never see them done again because of how badly this went. I want to make it very clear before I describe the situation that this actually is defensible in one way and one way only. This is not a morally correct thing that these players did, however, it is completely legal. I mention that because I saw so many discussions back when this happened about people saying, well, this is against the rules, they should be banned from tournament play. That's just not the case. A gentleman's agreement, as I described in the beginning of this video, is a way when the players go outside of the given rule set to impose their own restrictions on their particular locals or their particular tournaments or matches. So anyway, what happened in this last instance? Well, basically what happened is that people used to play one copy of Jin, Releaser of Rituals in their Nekroz strategies. That was a very degenerate way to win the game, and a lot of people were willing to do a gentleman's agreement to side out their one copy of Jin and put it in their side deck face up. However, unlike the previous 3 cards and 2 instances we've talked about, Jin is technically not a limited card. This matters because even though the standard way to play the Nekroz deck was to only use one copy in your main deck and then side it out if your opponent asked you to do a gentleman's agreement, these group of players figured out that if they sided a second additional copy of Jin, when they sided out the first one face up and their opponent did the same, they could side into the second copy, still having the combo available for them. This matters because then if you were playing any outs to the quote-unquote Jin lock, you would probably side them out because you didn't think your opponent even had the card in their deck. This caused an uproar in the community. It divided the community because a lot of people were saying, well, you should ban all these players for doing this. This is so unethical. And And while it probably is unethical, like I said, it's completely legal. When you do a gentleman's agreement, you're going outside of the rules and doing your own restrictions, but your opponent technically doesn't have to adhere to those restrictions. In the past, this didn't really matter because when people were doing it, they were doing it with limited cards. But yeah, in the case of Jin, because you play those extra copies and because you still technically side out one copy face up, it definitely was a scummy thing to do, but it was completely within the means of the rules back then. Actually, a lot of people hypothesize that this is one of the reasons that now these main and side deck are considered private knowledge and you're not even allowed to reveal them. It sort of moves away from this whole idea of, okay, can my opponent scum me with these gentlemen's agreements? Or if Konami just bans them altogether, I mean, not directly, but indirectly by making the side deck private knowledge, well, then you don't have to worry about it because no one's ever going to just believe their opponent and take their word without revealing the card face up. Anyway, though, that's pretty much going to wrap up today's video on gentlemen's agreements in Yu-Gi-Oh! I know a lot of people, when they hear that term, only think of Jin and Nekroz and Patrick Hoban, but there's so much more to it at so many different formats and levels of play that I felt it was important to make an entire video talking about. Gentlemen's agreements are very risky, and I'm glad that they're not in the game because they really put a lot of pressure on players. If you had your opponent say, let's agree not to use Firewall Dragon this game, then they summoned it, well, you're going to feel pretty bad because now you don't have your own copy. For this reason, for many others, it's probably best that they're just out of the game forever and they're in the policy documents as not being allowed. Anyway, though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.